The first thing Isabella Carson heard was the rattle of iron chains against stone, then the laughter, cruel, echoing through the narrow canyon walls like the cackle of demons celebrating another soul claimed for hell. Dozens of her own people, ranchers and townsfolk who had watched her grow from a pigtailed child into a woman of 22, stood in a jagged semicircle as the shackles bit deep into her wrists and ankles, binding her to the red rock wall of Coyote Hollow like some ancient sacrifice to their twisted sense of justice. Her name was Isabella Carson, but the man she loved called her Bella, whispering it like a prayer against her ear in stolen moments when the world couldn't see them. Together, her crime wasn't murder or theft, it was love. Love for a man whose skin bore the bronze kiss of desert sun, and whose blood carried the ancient songs of a people her father's generation had spent decades trying to destroy. Her punishment was to die alone in this forsaken place, chained to stone and left for the elements and scavengers to claim what remained of a heart that had dared to beat for someone deemed unworthy by the color of his skin. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade could reach. Her own father, Thomas Carson, had hammered the first spike into the rock face, his weathered hands steady despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. Her brother William had turned his back when she called his name, unable to watch, but unwilling to stop what their community demanded. Even Sarah Martinez, who had been her dearest friend since childhood, stood silent among the crowd, arms crossed, face hard as flint with the righteousness of those who believe suffering purifies sin. The last thing Bella saw before they abandoned her to this living tomb was the sky above Coyote Hollow, too vast, too indifferent, painted in shades of amber and crimson that mocked her with their beauty. The world didn't care that they were murdering her for the simple act of loving someone different. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the crowd had dispersed like smoke, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through stone and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, waiting for death to make its claim. But Isabella Carson had not lived 22 years on the harsh frontier to surrender easily to death. She had survived childhood fevers that claimed two of her siblings, endured the brutal winter when supplies ran low and families ate bark to stay alive, weathered Apache raids and outlaw attacks with the same fierce determination that now kept her breathing, despite the agony spreading through her limbs. The chains were heavy, yes, but they were not unbreakable. The rock was hard, but it could be worn away. Most importantly, her heart still beat with the rhythm of hope, because somewhere beyond these canyon walls, a man named Joseph Crow Feather was alive, and she would not die until she knew he was safe. The Carson family had arrived in Arizona territory in 1847, when Bella was barely 3 years old, and the land still bore the scars of war between Mexico and the expanding American nation. Her father Thomas had claimed 2,000 acres of prime grazing land in the Verde Valley, building his ranch with the sweat of his brow and the strength of his convictions. The rocking sea ranch became one of the most prosperous spreads in the sea territory, its success built on careful breeding of cattle, strategic water rights, and an iron-fisted approach to dealing with anyone who threatened what Thomas considered his rightful domain. For 19 years, Bella had lived the life expected of a rancher's daughter. She learned to ride before she could properly walk, could shoot a rifle with deadly accuracy by age 12, and managed the household accounts with a mathematical precision that impressed even the hardened businessmen who came to trade cattle with her father. She was beautiful in the way frontier women often were, strong-boned and sun-touched, with eyes the color of prairie grass after rain and hair that caught firelight like spun copper. More than a dozen young men from respectable families had asked for her hand, offering dowries and promising futures that would have secured her comfort for life. But Bella Carson had always possessed a spirit too wild for conventional cages. While other young women her age focused on needlework and social graces, she rode the boundaries of the ranch, learned to track game through rocky terrain, and spent long hours reading every book that made its way to their remote corner of the territory. She spoke passable Spanish from trading with Mexican vaqueros, picked up enough Apache words to conduct basic negotiations during tense encounters, and possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the narrow confines of her father's expectations. It was this curiosity that led her to the trading post in Prescott on a sweltering day in August of 1869, 3 years before she would find herself chained in Coyote Hollow. Thomas had sent her to town with a list of supplies needed for the ranch: salt, pork, ammunition, winter blankets, and medical supplies for the coming cold season. Bella had completed her business efficiently, as always, but found herself drawn to a small crowd gathered around a young Navajo man who was displaying an array of silver jewelry unlike anything she had ever seen. The artisan's name was Joseph Crow Feather, though she wouldn't learn this until weeks later. He was perhaps 25 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of quiet strength that came from a lifetime of surviving in harsh country. His hands moved with practiced grace as he shaped silver wire into intricate patterns, creating bracelets and necklaces that seemed to capture the very essence of the desert landscape in metal and turquoise. When he looked up and caught her staring, his dark eyes held a depth of intelligence that made her breath catch in her throat. "You have skilled hands," Bella said, stepping closer to examine a silver bracelet adorned with stones the color of summer sky. The crowd around them had begun to disperse, white settlers uncomfortable with the presence of a Navajo trader despite his obvious talent and peaceful demeanor. Joseph studied her face carefully, perhaps wondering if this was some kind of trap or cruel jest. "My grandfather taught me the old ways," he replied in careful English, his voice carrying the musical cadence of his native tongue. He said, "Silver remembers the songs we sing while shaping it. Each piece carries part of the maker's spirit." He held up the bracelet she had been admiring, turning it so the turquoise caught the afternoon light. This one sang of rain on red rock, of springs hidden deep in canyon country where the deer come to drink at sunset. Bella found herself purchasing not just the bracelet, but 3 more pieces: a necklace for her sister-in-law's birthday, a pair of earrings that reminded her of stars, and a small silver cross worked in a style she had never seen before. Joseph wrapped each piece carefully in soft leather, his movements economical and graceful. When their fingers brushed as he handed her the packages, she felt something electric pass between them, a recognition that went deeper than words or cultural boundaries. "Will you be at the trading post again next month?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Joseph hesitated, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard by any of the rough-looking men who had been eyeing his wares with barely concealed hostility. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "if the spirits will it, and if it is safe to return." The careful way he phrased his response reminded Bella of the growing tensions between white settlers and the various tribes that still moved through the territory. The army had established Fort Whipple nearby, but their presence seemed to inflame rather than calm the situation. Raids and counter-raids had become increasingly common, with innocent people on both sides paying the price for old grievances and new fears. Over the following months, Bella found excuses to visit Prescott whenever Joseph's trading schedule brought him to town. What began as simple commerce evolved into genuine friendship as they discovered shared interests in astronomy, literature, and the natural world around them. Joseph had learned to read English from a sympathetic missionary teacher, and his hunger for knowledge matched her own. They discussed everything from the seasonal migration patterns of antelope to the poetry of William Blake, finding in each other an intellectual companionship neither had expected to discover. Their conversations took place in public spaces, always proper, always observed by others. But gradually, inevitably, something deeper began to grow between them. Bella found herself thinking about Joseph's gentle humor during long evenings at the ranch, remembering the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about his family's traditional lands in Canyon de Chelly, treasuring the small gifts he began to offer. A perfectly shaped piece of turquoise, a hawk feather found during his travels, pressed flowers from meadows high in the mountains where his people gathered healing herbs. For his part, Joseph seemed equally drawn to this unusual white woman, who treated him with genuine respect rather than the mixture of fear and condescension he typically encountered from settlers. Bella asked thoughtful questions about Navajo customs and beliefs, shared stories of her own family's struggles to build a life in harsh country, and never once suggested that his way of life was inferior to her own. In a world where such attitudes were rare, her acceptance felt like water in the desert. The inevitable happened on a crisp October evening in 1871. Bella had ridden out alone to check on cattle grazing in the high meadows when she encountered Joseph returning from a trading expedition to the Mormon settlements near Flagstaff. They shared a simple meal beside a stream, talking until the stars emerged in brilliant profusion overhead. When the night air grew cold, Joseph offered her his blanket, and she accepted it along with the warmth of his arms around her shoulders. Their first kiss was tender, tentative, filled with the knowledge that they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. In that moment, surrounded by the vast silence of the desert night, they both understood that what they felt for each other was worth any risk, any consequence. Love, real love, was too rare and precious to sacrifice on the altar of social convention or racial prejudice. For nearly a year, they conducted their courtship in secret, meeting whenever his trading routes and her ranch duties allowed. Joseph taught her to see the desert through Navajo eyes, as a living entity deserving respect rather than conquest, as a harsh but fair teacher that rewarded those who learned to listen to its lessons. Bella shared her dreams of a world where people could love freely regardless of the color of their skin or the traditions of their ancestors. They spoke of marriage, of children, of building a life together in some distant place where their love wouldn't be seen as an abomination. Joseph had relatives among the Navajo communities far to the north, in countries so remote that the reach of white law barely extended there. Bella was willing to leave everything she had ever known for the chance to wake up beside him each morning, to build something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of a world too small for their dreams. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in small communities where everyone's business is everyone else's concern. Martha Fleming, the pastor's wife, had observed Bella's monthly trips to Prescott with growing suspicion. When she followed at a discreet distance one September afternoon and witnessed Bella and Joseph sharing an intimate conversation behind the trading post, her outrage knew no bounds. The news spread through the community like wildfire across dry grass. Within hours, every family within 50 miles knew that Thomas Carson's daughter had been consorting with a savage, that she had brought shame upon not only her family, but the entire white community that had trusted her to uphold their values and maintain the boundaries between civilization and barbarism. The fact that Joseph was known as a peaceful man, a skilled artisan, and an honest trader meant nothing in the face of racial hatred centuries in the making. Thomas Carson's reaction was swift and brutal. He locked Bella in her room and posted her brother William as guard, while he consulted with other prominent ranchers about how to handle this crisis. The consensus was clear. Bella must be punished in a way that would serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to cross racial lines. Her example would demonstrate the consequences of betraying one's own kind. They gave her one chance to recant, to publicly denounce Joseph and promise never to see him again. Standing in the ranch house parlor before an assembly of grim-faced men who had bounced her on their knees when she was small, Bella lifted her chin with all the pride her father had taught her and spoke the words that sealed her fate. "I love him, and I will not lie about it to save myself from your hatred." The sentence was exile and death, carried out in the traditional manner reserved for the worst crimes against community standards. They would chain her in Coyote Hollow, a narrow canyon 20 miles from the nearest settlement, and leave her there to die slowly from exposure, thirst, and starvation. Her suffering would purify the community of the contamination her actions had brought upon them. As the sun disappeared behind the canyon walls and true darkness settled over Coyote Hollow, Bella tested the limits of her chains systematically, searching for any weakness that might offer hope of escape. The iron shackles were well made and securely fastened, but the bolts holding them to the rock face showed signs of the relentless weathering that eventually claimed everything in this harsh country. If she could find a way to work them loose, if she could endure long enough for the elements to work in her favor rather than against her, she might yet survive to see Joseph's face again. The first night was the longest of her life, filled with the sounds of creatures moving in the darkness, the rustle of pack rats in the brush, the hunting call of an owl, the distant yip of coyotes that gave the hollow its name. But no human sounds reached her ears, no indication that anyone cared enough to check whether she still breathed. They had written her off as dead already, and perhaps that would prove to be their mistake. The second dawn brought with it a sound Isabella had not expected to hear in this forsaken place. The rhythmic strike of metal against stone, echoing off the canyon walls like a blacksmith's hammer against anvil. Through swollen eyes and cracked lips, she peered into the morning shadows and saw him, a lone figure mounted on a paint horse, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. Even from a distance, she could tell this was no white settler or cavalry scout. His long black hair fell freely past his shoulders, and he wore traditional Navajo clothing mixed with pieces of frontier gear, buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt, and a silver concho belt that caught the early sunlight like captured stars. The rider had stopped perhaps 50 yards from where she hung chained to the rock face, and for several long minutes he simply sat, motionless, studying her situation, with the patient intensity of a hunter evaluating dangerous game. Bella's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this might be her only chance for rescue, but she forced herself to remain silent, instinctively understanding that any sudden sound or movement might spook this mysterious figure into flight. When he finally dismounted and began walking toward her, she could see that he was young, perhaps her own age, with the lean build and confident stride of a warrior. His face bore the distinctive bone structure of the Diné, the Navajo people, but there was something different about his eyes, something that spoke of experiences far beyond his years. Scars marked his left cheek and the back of his hands, old wounds that had healed white against his bronze skin. This was a man who had survived battles, who had faced death and emerged victorious enough times to carry himself with the quiet authority of proven courage. "You are the Carson woman," he said when he reached speaking distance, his English precise despite a slight accent that added music to his words. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that revealed nothing of his intentions. Bella tried to speak, but found her throat too parched to produce more than a whispered croak. The stranger studied her condition for a moment, then returned to his horse and retrieved a leather water bag. He approached her carefully, watching for any sign of trap or deception, though what danger a chained woman could pose was unclear. When he lifted the water bag to her lips, the cool liquid felt like salvation flowing down her burning throat. She drank greedily until he pulled it away, rationing her intake with the wisdom of someone who understood that too much water too quickly could be as dangerous as none at all. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice still barely audible but functional enough for basic communication. The stranger corked the water bag and stepped back, once again studying her with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see more than they. Revealed, "I am called Tahoma Silversmith," he replied, settling into a crouch that suggested he was prepared to remain for some time. "My grandfather was known to your people as a maker of fine jewelry, and my father traded horses with some of the ranchers in your valley before the troubles began. I know the name Carson, and I know the stories they tell about you in the pueblo and in the trading posts, where men drink too much whiskey and speak too freely of their business." Bella felt a flush of shame heat her cheeks, despite her desperate circumstances. So her scandal had spread beyond the white community, becoming fodder for gossip among the various peoples who moved through this harsh territory. She wondered what version of events Tahoma had heard, whether the tales painted her as a victim or a willing participant in her own downfall. "What stories do they tell?" she asked, dreading the answer but needing to know how completely her reputation had been destroyed. Tahoma's expression remained neutral, but she thought she detected a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in his dark eyes. "They say Thomas Carson's daughter fell in love with a Dene man, that her people discovered this and punished her by chaining her in Coyote Hollow to die slowly as an example to others who might be tempted to cross the lines between peoples. They say she chose love over safety and paid the price for her choice," he replied, his voice carrying no judgment, merely stating facts as he understood them. "They also say the Dene man she loved has disappeared, that no one has seen Joseph Crowfeather since the day his woman was condemned." At the mention of Joseph's name, Bella's composure cracked, and tears began streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. The confirmation that Joseph was alive somewhere filled her with relief, but his disappearance terrified her. Had he fled the territory to save his own life? Had her family's friends tracked him down and exacted their own brutal justice? Was he even now lying dead in some remote canyon, his crime being that he had dared to love a white woman? "Is he safe?" she whispered, the question containing all her hopes and fears. "Please, if you know anything about what happened to him, I need to know. I don't care what they do to me, but I have to know that he's alive." Tahoma was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the iron shackles that bound her to the stone, then out toward the canyon entrance, where dust devils danced in the morning heat. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested intimate knowledge of the situation. "Joseph Crowfeather is my cousin," he said simply. "Son of my mother's sister, raised in the same hogan until he was old enough to begin his own path as a silversmith and trader. When word reached our people that the white ranchers had condemned his woman to die in this place, he went half mad with grief and rage. It took 6 men to prevent him from riding directly to your father's ranch to challenge every man there to single combat." The relief that flooded through Bella was so intense it left her dizzy. Joseph was alive, and more than that, he cared enough to risk his own life attempting to save her. But the relief was quickly tempered by a new fear. If Joseph came charging into a situation controlled by her father and his allies, he would be walking into certain death. The white community was prepared for violent retaliation, had probably spent the past 2 days organizing patrols and setting up ambush points along all the likely approaches to their settlements. "You have to stop him," she said urgently, straining against her chains in her desperation to make Tahoma understand the danger. "If he tries to rescue me directly, they'll kill him. My father and his friends are expecting some kind of revenge attack. They're probably watching every trail, every waterhole, every place where a Navajo warrior might approach. Joseph is brave, but he's one man against dozens who are prepared for war." Tahoma nodded slowly, confirming her fears. "This is why I am here instead of Joseph. The elders of our people held council and decided that sending him would be the same as sending him to his death. They chose me to come because I have skills that might succeed where direct confrontation would fail. I've been a scout for the army, have learned the ways of white men's warfare, understand how they think and how they prepare for battle. This revelation surprised Bella, adding another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. A Navajo who had served as a scout for the U.S. Army was a rarity, someone who walked between worlds with all the dangers and advantages such a position entailed. He would be trusted by neither side completely, suspected of divided loyalties, forever balancing on the knife's edge between cultures that viewed each other as enemies. "Why would you risk yourself for someone you don't know?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by his willingness to help her. "Joseph is your cousin. I understand that bond. But I'm a stranger, a white woman whose people have done nothing but bring trouble to yours. What do you gain by helping me?" Tahoma stood and walked to the edge of the shade cast by the overhanging rock, staring out at the shimmering heat waves that already made the canyon floor look like a lake of liquid fire. When he turned back to face her, his expression had softened, slightly, revealing something of the man beneath the warrior's mask. "I was married once," he said quietly, "to a Mexican woman I met while scouting for the army near the border. Her name was Esperanza, which means hope in her language. Like you, she was punished by her people for loving someone they considered beneath her station. Unlike you, no one came to help her when they decided she had shamed her family beyond redemption." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakably real. Bella found herself holding her breath as she waited for him to continue, sensing that he was sharing something he rarely spoke of, even to close friends or family members. "They threw her from the church tower in Tubac on the day of the feast of San Juan," he continued, his words coming slowly as if each one carried physical weight. "Claimed she had been possessed by demons, that her unnatural desires had corrupted her soul beyond salvation. I was 3 days' ride away, tracking Apache raiders with a cavalry patrol. By the time I returned, she was already buried in ground they said was too sacred for her contaminated body." The horrible parallel between his story and her own situation was not lost on Bella. Both women condemned by their own people for the crime of loving across racial lines, both subjected to brutal punishments, designed as warnings to others who might be tempted to challenge social boundaries. The difference was that Esperanza had died alone, while Bella still had a chance for rescue. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Inadequate words for such profound loss, but the only comfort she could offer. She must have been very special to earn love. "Like yours." She was sunlight and laughter and everything good that this hard country rarely allows people to keep, Tahoma replied. "When they killed her, they killed part of me as well. But they also created something new, something that burns like a forge fire in my chest whenever I see cruelty masquerading as righteousness. I could not save Esperanza, but perhaps I can save you. Perhaps in doing so, I can give meaning to her death." The intensity of his commitment both humbled and terrified Bella. She had become a symbol for him, a chance to balance some cosmic ledger that had been rendered unjust by his wife's murder. The weight of such expectations felt almost as heavy as the iron chains that bound her to the stone. "What is your plan?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Any scheme that offered real hope of escape would necessarily involve enormous risks, not just for herself, but for this man who had already suffered more than his share of loss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tahoma returned to his crouch beside her, close enough that she could see the intelligence burning in his dark eyes, as he considered the tactical challenges they faced. "The men who put you here will return," he said matter-of-factly. "Not today, probably not tomorrow, but soon. They will want to confirm that you are dead, to see with their own eyes that their justice has been carried out." When they come, they will expect to find only bones picked clean by scavengers. The casual way he discussed her expected death sent chills down Bella's spine, despite the growing heat of the day. But she forced herself to listen carefully, understanding that her survival depended on grasping whatever strategy he had devised. Instead, they will find an empty set of shackles and no trace of where you have gone, Tahoma continued. By then you will be far from here, hidden among my people in country so remote that even the army rarely ventures there. But first, we must make you disappear in a way that leaves no trail for tracking, no evidence that anyone helped you escape. How? Is that possible? Bella asked, examining the heavy iron shackles that seemed designed to hold her until death claimed her. These chains are solid, and I can barely move my hands enough to scratch my nose. Even if you have tools to cut through the metal, the noise would carry for miles in this canyon. Tahoma smiled for the first time since their conversation began, an expression that transformed his stern features and revealed the younger man, hidden beneath layers of grief and responsibility. I am a silversmith, trained by masters who could shape metal as easily as other men shape clay. These locks may seem impregnable to you, but they were made by men who understand only force, not finesse. From his belt, he produced a set of small metal tools, unlike anything Bella had ever seen. They looked almost like surgical instruments, delicate and precise, designed for intricate work rather than brute destruction. As she watched in fascination, Tahoma examined the lock mechanism that secured her wrist shackles, his fingers probing with the sensitivity of a musician tuning a fine instrument. The white man's locks rely on springs and tumblers, he explained, as he worked, inserting one of the tools into the keyhole and manipulating something inside with practiced skill. They are clever mechanisms, but they follow predictable patterns. My grandfather taught me that all things made by human hands can be unmade by human understanding. Within minutes, the first lock clicked open with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the canyon's silence. Bella stared in amazement as the heavy shackle fell away from her wrist, leaving behind an angry red mark, but also the first real freedom she had experienced in 2 days. The relief was so intense that she began to cry again, tears of hope rather than despair. Quietly, Tahoma cautioned as he moved to work on the remaining locks. Sound carries strangely in these canyons, and we cannot know who might be listening. Your people may have posted watchers to ensure that no rescue attempt is made. The remaining shackles yielded to his skill with equal swiftness, each lock surrendering its grip as if it had never been designed to hold anyone captive. When the last iron band fell away from her ankle, Bella collapsed forward, her legs too weak from cramping and poor circulation to support her weight. Tahoma caught her before she could fall, his strong arms providing the support she needed as feeling began to return to her extremities. "Can you ride?" he asked, helping her to a sitting position against the rock wall. "We have perhaps an hour before the sun makes travel impossible, and every minute we delay increases the risk of discovery." Bella tested her legs cautiously, finding them shaky but functional. The prospect of mounting a horse seemed daunting in her current condition, but the alternative, remaining chained to die slowly in this desolate place, provided powerful motivation for recovery. "I can ride," she said with more confidence than she felt. "But what about the tracks we'll leave? Even I know that a blind man could follow the trail of 2 horses across this country." Tahoma's smile returned, broader this time and tinged with what might have been admiration for her. Practical thinking despite her desperate circumstances. "This is why the spirits chose me for this task," he replied. "I know secrets of this land that few men living can claim." He helped her to her feet and supported her as they walked slowly toward his waiting horse. The paint gelding was a magnificent animal, well-muscled and alert, with the deep chest, and strong hindquarters that spoke of careful breeding for endurance rather than speed. His tack was a mixture of traditional Navajo craftsmanship and practical frontier gear, designed for long journeys through difficult country. "His name is Windwalker," Tahoma explained as he helped Bella examine the horse's temperament. "He was born during a storm that the old men said would change the world, and he has never failed to carry me safely through danger. He will carry both of us today, and he will do so without leaving tracks that your people can follow." As if to demonstrate his master's claim, Windwalker stood perfectly still while Bella ran her hands over his neck and shoulders, accepting her touch with the calm confidence of a horse accustomed to unusual circumstances. His hooves, she noticed, were wrapped in soft leather boots that would muffle sound and blur any impressions left in soft ground. "Where are we going?" she asked, as Tahoma helped her mount behind him. The simple act of sitting upright on horseback felt like a return to life after her ordeal chained to the stone. Despite her physical weakness, she experienced a surge of hope that maybe, somehow, she really might survive this nightmare. "First, we ride to water," Tahoma replied, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins. "Then we follow paths known only to my people, trails that were old when your grandfather was young. By tonight, you will be safe among the Diné, and your Joseph will know that his woman lives." As Windwalker carried them away from Coyote, Bella looked back once at the iron shackles lying abandoned on the red stone. They looked smaller now, less significant, like the discarded shell of some creature that had outgrown the need for such crude protection. She was still far from safety, still dependent on the kindness of strangers and the skills of a man she had known for less than an hour. But for the first time since her ordeal began, Isabella Carson felt truly alive, carried toward an uncertain but hopeful future by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the quiet strength of a warrior who understood that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price that honor demanded be paid. The hidden spring lay nestled in a fold of red rock that seemed impossible to find unless one knew exactly where to look. Its location revealed only by the subtle green of cottonwood leaves that caught the eye of those trained to read the desert's secret language. Tahoma guided Windwalker through a narrow gap between towering stone walls, following what appeared to be nothing more than a game trail worn smooth by generations of deer and elk seeking water in this harsh country. Isabella marveled at how completely invisible their passage had become. The rocky ground showed no trace of hoofprints, and their route twisted through terrain so broken and confusing that even she, raised in this territory, would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. "My great-grandfather showed me this place when I was still young enough to believe that spirits lived in every stone and stream," Tahoma said as they approached the spring, his voice carrying a reverence that spoke of deep connection to this land. "He told me that water like this, hidden from the world and protected by stone, holds special power for those who drink from it with grateful hearts. He said it could wash away old sorrows and give strength for new journeys." The spring itself was a marvel of nature's artistry, emerging from a crack in the cliff face to form a pool perhaps 10 feet across, its surface mirror-clear and so still, it perfectly reflected the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone around the water's edge, spirals and handprints and figures that might have been human or might have been something else entirely, carved by people whose names were lost to time, but whose reverence for this sacred place remained evident in every careful line. Isabella slid down from Windwalker's back with Tahoma's assistance, her legs still shaky but growing stronger with each hour of freedom. The horse immediately moved to the water's edge and began drinking with the careful patience of an animal accustomed to desert travel, taking only what he needed and never fouling the source that might mean life or death to future travelers. "Drink slowly," Tahoma advised, as Isabella knelt beside the pool and cupped the crystalline water in her hands. Your body has been without proper water for 2 days, and too much too quickly will make you sick when we need you to be strong. The water was shockingly cold, despite the desert heat, carrying the taste of deep stone and ancient minerals that spoke of its journey through underground passages far from the touch of sun or wind. Isabella forced herself to sip carefully, despite her body's desperate craving for more, understanding that Tahoma's advice came from hard experience with desert survival. As she drank, she studied the petroglyphs surrounding the spring, wondering about the hands that had carved them and the stories they were meant to tell. "What do the symbols mean?" she asked, tracing one of the spiral patterns with her finger, while being careful not to touch the ancient stone. Even in her desperate circumstances, something about this place demanded respect for its obvious sacred nature. Tahoma knelt beside her, his own eyes following the intricate designs that covered every available surface around the spring. "Some tell of the journey people must take to find water in dry times," he explained, pointing to a series of connected circles that seemed to map a complex path through the desert. "Others speak of the spirits that live in places like this, guardians who protect sacred water from those who would take it without giving thanks or thought for future need." He indicated a larger petroglyph that depicted human figures standing around what might have been a pool of water, their arms raised towards stylized representations of sky and clouds. This one tells of a time when the rains failed for 7 years and the people suffered greatly. The story says that a young woman had a vision of this spring, hidden deep in the stone country, and she led her people here when all other water sources had failed. They survived the drought because she was brave enough to follow dreams that others dismissed as impossible. The parallel between that ancient story and Isabella's current situation was not lost on either of them. Here was another woman whose survival depended on following an unlikely path, trusting in the knowledge and courage of someone willing to risk everything for the sake of preserving life and hope. "Do you think she was afraid?" Isabella asked, still studying the petroglyph of the woman who had led her people to salvation. When she first saw the vision, when she tried to convince others to follow her into unknown country, do you think she felt the terror that I feel now? Tahoma was quiet for several minutes, refilling his water bag and checking Windwalker's condition while he considered her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with similar fears and found a way to transform them into strength. "I think she was more afraid of letting her people die than she was of dying herself," he said. "Finally, fear is not something to be conquered or eliminated. It is information that helps us understand what matters most. Your fear tells you that Joseph's life has value, that love is worth preserving, that some things are more important than personal safety." As they prepared to leave the spring, Tahoma performed a brief ritual that Isabella did not fully understand, but instinctively respected. He sprinkled a small amount of corn pollen on the water's surface while speaking words in Navajo that sounded like both prayer and promise. Then he placed his hands on the stone beside the pool for a moment, his head bowed in what was clearly a gesture of gratitude. "We ask permission to drink, and we promise to protect this place from those who would harm it," he explained when he noticed Isabella's curious expression. "All things are connected in ways that white men's science does not understand. The water that sustains us today may be needed by travelers yet to come, perhaps our own children or grandchildren seeking refuge from troubles we cannot imagine." Their departure from the spring marked the beginning of the most challenging phase of their journey, as Tahoma led them into country so remote and difficult that Isabella began to understand why even the army rarely ventured into these hidden canyons and mesas. The trails, when they existed at all, were often nothing more than ledges carved into sheer cliff faces by centuries of wind and weather, barely wide enough for a single horse and rider. Windwalker navigated these treacherous paths with the sure-footed confidence of a mountain goat, never hesitating even when the trail seemed to disappear entirely into smooth rock faces or drop away into seemingly bottomless chasms. Isabella found herself closing her eyes during the most terrifying passages, trusting completely in Tahoma's knowledge and the horse's instincts while trying not to think about the consequences of a single misstep. "This is why your people will never find us," Tahoma said during one of their brief rest stops, pointing back toward the maze of canyons and ridges they had already traversed. "Even if they somehow discovered that you had escaped Coyote Hollow, even if they could track us to the spring, they would need guides who know every secret of this country to follow us further. Such guides exist, but they would never help White. Men pursue someone who had committed no crime except loving the wrong person." The afternoon heat had become a living thing, radiating up from the stone beneath them and pressing down from the brassy sky above with an intensity that made the air shimmer like water. Isabella's clothes were soaked with sweat despite the dry climate, and she found herself struggling to focus on anything beyond the immediate necessities of staying mounted and maintaining her grip on Tahoma's belt as Windwalker carried them deeper into the labyrinth of stone. "How much farther?" she asked during another rest stop, this one beside a tiny seep of water that barely wet the stone around it but provided enough moisture for Windwalker to ease his thirst. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hoarse and thin from the dry air and the emotional strain of the past few days. "We will reach the main camp before full darkness," Tahoma replied, though his expression suggested concern about something he was not ready to share. "But first, we must pass through the Whispering Stones, a place where the spirits of the old ones still walk. It is not dangerous if one shows proper respect, but it can be unsettling for those not prepared for what they might see or hear." The Whispering Stones proved to be a circular valley surrounded by towering red monoliths that rose from the desert floor like ancient sentinels, their surfaces carved by wind and time into shapes that seemed almost deliberately crafted to resemble human faces or reaching hands. The acoustics of the place were strange and disorienting. Sounds echoed and re-echoed among the stone towers in ways that made it impossible to determine their source or direction. As they rode through the valley, Isabella began to understand why the Navajo considered this a place of spirits. The wind, moving among the stone formations, created sounds that were almost like voices, murmuring conversations in languages she could not identify. Shadows moved in ways that seemed independent of the sun's position, and more than once she could have sworn she saw human figures standing among the rocks, watching their passage with eyes that held the depth of centuries. "Do not look too closely at things that might not be there," Tahoma advised, his own voice subdued by the atmosphere of the place. "The spirits here are not evil, but they remember times when all this land belonged to the Diné, and they sometimes become confused about which visitors welcome and which should be turned away." Windwalker seemed as affected by the place as his human passengers, stepping more carefully than usual and occasionally snorting or shaking his head as if responding to stimuli that Isabella could not perceive. The horse's nervousness was infectious, and she found herself gripping Tahoma's belt more tightly as they made their way across the valley floor toward a gap between two of the largest monoliths. It was as they approached this gap that Isabella saw something that made her question her own sanity. Standing in the shadow of the leftmost monolith was a woman dressed in traditional Navajo clothing, her long gray hair braided with turquoise and silver ornaments that caught the light despite the deep shade. She was clearly elderly, but her posture was erect and dignified, and her dark eyes tracked their movement with unmistakable intelligence. "Tahoma," Isabella whispered, not wanting to speak loudly in this strange place, but needing to know if he too could see the figure. "There's a woman watching us." Tahoma followed her gaze and nodded solemnly, raising one hand in what appeared to be a respectful greeting toward the watching figure. The woman inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, then raised her own hand and spoke words that carried clearly across the valley despite the distance between them. She says that the path you have chosen leads to both great joy and great sorrow," Tahoma translated, his voice carrying a note of awe that suggested this encounter was significant even by his standards. "She says that the young woman behind you carries two destinies, one that ends in death and one that leads to the birth of new hope for both our peoples. She says the choice between these futures will come soon, and it will not be made by you or by me." Before Isabella could ask what the cryptic message meant, the elderly woman simply stepped backward into the shadow of the monolith and vanished, as completely as if she had never been there at all. Windwalker snorted and pawed the ground nervously, clearly eager to leave this place of ancient powers and uncertain visions. "Who was she?" Isabella asked as they rode through the gap between the monoliths and left the whispering stones behind them. The normal sounds of the desert, wind through stone, the cry of a hawk circling overhead, the distant yip of coyotes beginning their evening songs, seemed almost startling after the supernatural quiet of the valley. "My great-grandmother," Tahoma replied matter-of-factly, as if encounters with deceased relatives were a normal part of desert travel. "She died when I was 12 years old, but the old ones sometimes return to offer guidance when the living face choices that will affect future generations." Her words were not prophecy, but warning. There are difficult times ahead, and the decisions we make in the next few days will shape the lives of people not yet born. The practical implications of this mystical encounter were too much for Isabella's exhausted mind to fully process, but she filed the warning away for future consideration. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever choices she would be forced to make, at least she was no longer facing them alone and chained to stone in a desolate canyon. As the sun began its final descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that took Isabella's breath away despite her fatigue, they crested a low ridge and looked down into a hidden valley that seemed to exist in a different world entirely. Green grass carpeted the valley floor, nourished by a stream that meandered through groves of cottonwood and willow trees. Horses grazed peacefully in natural meadows, and the smoke from several cooking fires rose straight up into the still air. But it was the sight of the people moving around the camp that brought tears to Isabella's eyes and made her heart race with anticipation and terror. Dozens of Navajo men, women and children went about the evening routines of a traveling band, tending fires, preparing food, caring for animals and equipment. And standing beside one of the fires, his back to the ridge where they approached, was a tall figure whose posture and bearing were as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Joseph Crowfeather was alive, safe among his people, and in a few more minutes she would either be reunited with the man she loved or discover that even survival was not enough to bridge the gulf that circumstances had opened between them. The moment Joseph Crowfeather turned at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, Isabella saw that the man she loved had been transformed by grief into something harder and more dangerous than the gentle artisan she remembered. His face, once quick to smile and soft with tenderness when he looked at her, now bore the lean intensity of a wolf that has been hunted too long and learned to bare its teeth at every shadow. Scars marked his knuckles and forearms, fresh wounds that spoke of violence recent enough to still ache, and his dark eyes held a burning fury that made her breath catch in her throat with sudden fear. "Bella," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer answered and a curse fulfilled. In the same breath, he strode toward Windwalker with long, urgent steps, his hands reaching up to help her down from the horse before Tahoma had even brought the animal to a complete stop. The moment her feet touched the ground, Joseph's arms closed around her, with desperate strength holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, as if he were afraid she might dissolve like a mirage if he loosened his grip. But when she tried to speak, to tell him about her ordeal and her rescue, he pulled back and gripped her shoulders with hands that trembled with barely controlled rage. "They chained you like an animal," he said, his voice low and dangerous as he examined the angry red marks the iron shackles had left on her wrists and ankles. "Left you to die slowly in that cursed place while they went home to sleep in comfortable beds and dream of their righteous justice." The fury radiating from him was so intense that Isabella found herself taking a step backward, suddenly uncertain of the man she thought she knew better than anyone in the world. This was not the Joseph who had courted her with gentle words and small gifts, who had spoken of building a life together filled with love and laughter and children who would bridge the gap between their peoples. This was someone new, someone shaped by rage and thoughts of vengeance that burned in his eyes like forge fires. "Joseph, please," she began, but he was already turning away from her to face Tahoma, his attention shifting to practical matters with the focused intensity of a warrior planning for battle. The camp around them had gone quiet, conversations stopping as dozens of people watched the reunion, with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern to something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. "How many men guard the approaches to the Carson Ranch?" Joseph asked his cousin, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to giving orders and expecting immediate obedience. "How are they armed, and what are their patrol patterns? I need to know everything you observed during the rescue." Tahoma dismounted from Windwalker with the deliberate slowness of someone choosing his words carefully, clearly recognizing the danger in his cousin's current state of mind. "The ranch is prepared for war," he replied honestly. "Thomas Carson has called in favors from every rancher and merchant in the territory. There are at least 40 men on the property, all armed with rifles and positioned to cover every approach. They expect you to come for revenge, Joseph, and they are prepared to kill you the moment you show yourself." Instead of discouraging Joseph's obvious plans for retaliation, this information seemed only to fuel his anger. He began pacing around, the fire like a caged predator, his hands clenching and unclenching as he calculated odds and possibilities. 40 men, he repeated almost to himself, dug in like ticks on a dog, thinking their numbers and their preparation make them safe from the justice they've earned. Isabella watched this display with growing alarm, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what her rescue had cost. Joseph's reputation as a peaceful trader, his carefully maintained relationships with white merchants and officials, his dreams of building bridges between cultures, all of it had been sacrificed on the altar of his rage at her treatment. The gentle man she had fallen in love with was still there somewhere beneath the surface, but he had been buried under layers of fury and thoughts of violence that threatened to consume everything good he had ever been. "What are you planning?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. The other people in the camp were watching Joseph with the careful attention of warriors awaiting orders, and she could see weapons being checked and cleaned around several of the fires. This was not a peaceful trading expedition or a simple family gathering. It was a war party preparing for a raid that would likely end in death for everyone involved. "I'm planning to show your people what happens when they mistake Navajo. Mercy for weakness," Joseph replied without looking at her, his attention focused on a crude map he was sketching in the dirt with a stick. "They think they can chain you in the desert to die and face no consequences for their cruelty. They think we are savages who will accept such treatment because we are too primitive to understand the concept of justice." The bitterness in his voice cut Isabella like a blade, but it was the quiet support she saw on the faces around the camp that truly terrified her. These were not bloodthirsty warriors eager for violence. They were ordinary people, grandparents and young parents and teenagers who had been pushed beyond endurance by the casual cruelty of white settlers who viewed them as less than human. Her suffering had become a symbol of everything they had endured, and their willingness to follow Joseph into what amounted to suicide spoke to depths of pain she was only beginning to comprehend. "You'll all be killed," she said flatly, abandoning diplomacy for brutal honesty. "My father and his friends aren't frontier farmers with old muskets and good intentions. They're hard men who've survived Apache raids and outlaw attacks and army patrols sent to pacify this territory. They know how to fight, Joseph, and they know how to kill efficiently and without mercy." For the first time since her arrival, Joseph turned to look directly at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart clench with grief for the man. He had been before her love destroyed his peace. "Then I will die fighting men who deserve to die," he said simply. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Better that than living with the knowledge that they suffered no price for what they did to you. The fatalistic certainty in his voice broke something inside Isabella that had survived everything her own people had done to her. She began to cry, not the tears of fear or pain that had sustained her through her ordeal in Coyote Hollow, but the deeper grief of someone watching love transform itself into poison. This was not what she had wanted, not what she had dreamed of during the long hours chained to stone and praying for rescue. She had imagined reunion followed by escape to some distant place where they could build a new life together, not this preparation for a war that would end with Joseph's beautiful hands stained with blood or stilled forever in death. "I won't be the reason you become a killer," she said, her voice breaking with the effort of speaking words that felt like swallowing glass. "I won't let my suffering justify yours or anyone else's. If you do this thing, if you attack my father's ranch and kill those men, you'll be proving everything they said about us was true. That love between our peoples only leads to violence and death." The camp fell silent at her words, conversations dying as everyone within hearing range absorbed the implications of what she was saying. Even Joseph stopped his pacing to stare at her, his expression shifting from anger to confusion to something that might have been hurt. She could see him struggling to understand how she could ask him to swallow his rage and accept injustice. "When justice was finally within reach, they would have let you die," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "Chained you to stone and walked away, content to let thirst and heat and scavengers claim what remained of the woman. I love more than my own life. How can you ask me to forgive that? How can you expect me to turn my back on the chance to make them pay for such cruelty?" Isabella wiped her eyes and looked around the circle of faces surrounding the fire, seeing in each one a story of loss and struggle that mirrored her own in different ways. These were people who understood suffering, who had lost children to disease and violence, who had watched their traditional lands disappear under the advance of white settlement and their old ways dismissed as primitive superstition. Her ordeal was just one more entry in a ledger of grievances that stretched back generations. But she also saw something else in those weathered faces, a weariness that spoke of too many battles fought and too many loved ones buried, a hunger for something better than the endless cycle of violence and retaliation that had defined relationships between their peoples for as long as anyone could remember. In the eyes of the grandmothers tending the fires, in the careful attention of young fathers checking their weapons, she recognized a desperate hope that somehow, some way, this might be the beginning of something different rather than just another chapter in an old story of hatred. "I'm not asking you to forgive," she said, addressing not just Joseph but everyone within hearing range. "I'm asking you to be better than they are. I'm asking you to prove that love is stronger than hate, that mercy is braver than vengeance, that we can choose to build something new instead of just tearing down what already exists." Joseph's face went through several rapid changes of expression. As her words sank in, anger warring with love, the desire for revenge battling against the gentler instincts that had first drawn him to her. She could see the moment when understanding began to dawn, when he started to grasp the larger implications of the choice before him. "You're asking me to let them win," he said, but his voice had lost its sharp edge of certainty. "To walk away and pretend that what they did doesn't matter, that your suffering counts for nothing in the scales of justice. I'm asking you to let us win," Isabella replied, stepping closer to him and placing her hands on his chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart beneath her palms. "Not by destroying our enemies, but by refusing to become like them, by choosing love over hate, creation over destruction, hope over despair." The silence that followed her words stretched out like a held breath, filled with the weight of a decision that would echo through both their peoples for generations to come. Isabella could feel the attention of the entire camp focused on Joseph's face, waiting to see which path he would choose, the familiar road of violence and revenge, or the harder journey toward something that might eventually lead to real peace. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the perfect quiet of the desert evening, every word carried clearly to the edge of the camp. "What would you have me do, Bella? How do we build this better world you speak of, when they see our mercy as weakness and our love as an invitation to further cruelty?" Before Isabella could answer, a commotion at the edge of the camp drew everyone's attention. Riders were approaching, several of them moving fast and kicking up clouds of dust that glowed golden in the last rays of sunlight. The Navajo warriors immediately reached for their weapons, but Tahoma raised his hand in a gesture that commanded stillness. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to reading danger in the desert's subtle signs. "Those are not war ponies, and the riders sit their saddles like men carrying burdens rather than weapons. Something else is happening here." As the riders drew closer, Isabella felt her heart stop as she recognized the lead figure. Thomas Carson, her father, rode at the front of a group of 5 men, but instead of the armed posse she might have expected, they appeared to be traveling under some kind of flag of truce. Her father's face was haggard with exhaustion and something that looked like genuine grief, and the men with him rode with the careful posture of people hoping desperately not to provoke a fight they could not win. "My God," Isabella whispered, realizing that the most dangerous moment of this entire ordeal might be about to begin. "He's come for me himself." Joseph's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, his body tensing for violence even as his mind struggled to process this unexpected development. The reunion between Isabella and her father, between the man she loved and the man who had condemned her to die, was about to take place, surrounded by armed warriors whose loyalty to Joseph ran deeper than blood and whose patience with white cruelty had been stretched to the breaking point. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and the desert would run red with blood from both sides, making Isabella's nightmare complete and destroying any hope that love could ever triumph over the hatred that had poisoned relationships between their peoples for far too long. Thomas Carson dismounted his horse with the careful movements of a man who knew he was completely at the mercy of people who had every reason to kill him on sight. His weathered hands shook slightly as he removed his hat, revealing grey hair that seemed to have aged years in the few days since Isabella had last seen him. The other men with him remained mounted, but kept their hands conspicuously away from their weapons, understanding that they were outnumbered 10-1, and that their survival depended entirely on the restraint of warriors who had precious little reason to show mercy. "I've come to speak with my daughter," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the camp with the kind of quiet authority that had made him a respected leader among the territorial settlers. But there was something else in his tone now, something that sounded remarkably like humility, a quality Isabella had never heard from her proud father in all her 22 years of life. Joseph stepped protectively in front of Isabella, his hand still resting on his knife handle as he studied the approaching white men for any sign of deception or hidden threat. "You lost the right to call her daughter when you chained her in the desert to die," he said, his voice carrying the cold precision of barely controlled rage. "She belongs to my people now, under our protection, beyond the reach of your twisted justice." But Isabella moved around Joseph's protective bulk, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and desperate hope as she looked into her father's face and saw something she had never expected to find there. Genuine remorse, mingled with a grief so profound it had carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. This was not the righteously angry patriarch who had condemned her for loving the wrong man, but a broken father who had discovered too late the true cost of his prejudice. "Papa," she whispered, the childhood name slipping out before she could stop herself. Despite everything he had done, despite the chains and the abandonment and the sentence of death, some part of her still yearned for the man who had taught her to ride and shoot and manage ranch accounts, who had held her during thunderstorms when she was small and afraid of the lightning that split the desert sky. Thomas took a tentative step forward, then stopped when several Navajo warriors shifted their positions to keep him clearly in their sights. His eyes never left Isabella's face, drinking in the sight of her as if he were trying to memorize every detail. "Bella," he said, and her name on his lips carried a weight of emotion that made several of the watching women glance away in recognition of private pain made public. "I thought you were dead," he continued, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "When we found the empty shackles in Coyote Hollow, when we saw no trace of where you had gone or who might have taken you, I assumed that scavengers had carried off your remains. I came here to ask these people if they had found your bones, if they might allow me to give you a proper burial." The admission that he had been prepared to humble himself before the Navajo, to beg for the return of what he thought were his daughter's remains, sent a shock wave through both groups of people gathered around the campfire. The Thomas Carson that Isabella remembered was a proud man who would have died before showing such vulnerability to people he considered his enemies. "But you're alive," he whispered, taking another small step forward. "Thank God Almighty, you're alive, and I have a chance to ask your forgiveness for the most terrible mistake a father could make." Joseph moved to block Thomas's approach, his body tense with the readiness for violence that had been building in him for days. "Mistake," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You called chaining your own daughter to die in the desert a mistake. What would you call it if you had actually meant to hurt her? Murder." But Thomas didn't flinch from Joseph's anger, didn't retreat or reach for weapons, or show any of the defensive reactions Isabella might have expected from a man accustomed to solving problems with force and intimidation. Instead, he looked directly into Joseph's eyes with an expression of such profound shame that it was almost painful to witness. "I would call it the act of a man who let fear and hatred poison his judgment until he could no longer tell the difference between protecting his family and destroying it," Thomas replied. "I would call it the greatest sin a father could commit, loving his pride more than his child." The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a dying fire, carrying implications that reached far beyond this single confrontation. Isabella could feel the attention of everyone in the camp focused on this moment, understanding instinctively that what happened next would either begin a new chapter in the bloody history between their peoples or simply add another verse to an old song of violence and revenge. "Why should we believe you? asked an elderly Navajo woman who had been tending one of the cooking fires, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions carried weight in tribal councils. White men speak many words of regret when they find themselves surrounded by warriors, but their hearts change again when they return to the safety of their own kind. Thomas turned to face the woman with the same careful respect he might have shown to a territorial judge, recognizing her status even if he didn't fully understand the social structures that gave her such authority. "Because I brought proof of my intentions," he said, gesturing toward one of the mounted men behind him. The rider, Thomas, indicated dismounted and approached the fire carrying a leather document case that looked official enough to contain territorial government papers. He was a thin, nervous-looking man in a dark suit, who was clearly not accustomed to finding himself in the middle of armed confrontations between hostile groups. "This is Samuel Morrison, the territorial clerk of courts," Thomas explained. "I've had him prepare legal documents that will transfer ownership of my ranch and all my holdings to Isabella, effective immediately and irrevocable under territorial law. If she chooses to return with me, she will do so not as a daughter under her father's authority, but as an independent woman of property who can make her own decisions about her life and her future." The implications of this offer sent another shockwave through both groups of people. Isabella stared at her father in amazement, unable to believe that the proud, controlling man she had known all her life was prepared to sign away everything he had built in the territory as penance for his treatment of her, and if she chooses not to return? Joseph asked, his voice still suspicious but no longer carrying the same sharp edge of hostility. The offer of real legal power, of property and independence that would allow Isabella to make choices without fear of retaliation, was more than he had dared hope for. "Then the property still becomes hers," Thomas replied. "She can sell it, manage it from a distance, or give it away to anyone she chooses, including the Navajo people who saved her life when her own father failed her. The only condition is that she lives, that she has the freedom to build whatever kind of life she wants, with whoever she wants to build it with." Isabella felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she began to understand the magnitude of what her father was offering. The Rocking Sea Ranch represented 25 years of backbreaking work, the fulfillment of dreams that had brought her family across half a continent in search of a better life. For Thomas to sign it away meant abandoning everything he had lived for, choosing his daughter's happiness over his own legacy. But there was more to his offer than simple material generosity. By transferring legal ownership to her, he was also granting her something even more valuable, the power to protect Joseph and his people from the kind of retaliation that would normally follow such a dramatic rescue. As a property owner with standing in territorial courts, Isabella could provide legal cover for the Navajo band, could offer them employment and protection under the complex web of laws that governed relations between white settlers and native peoples. "There's something else," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he saw the impact his words were having. "I've been talking to other ranchers and business owners in the territory, men who have watched this situation unfold and begun to question their own attitudes toward the native peoples. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but enough to make a difference." He gestured toward the other mounted men, and Isabella realized for the first time that she recognized several of them. Merchants from Prescott, ranchers from neighboring spreads, even the banker who held mortgages on half the property in the valley. These were not men who would normally risk their reputations by associating with someone who had defied social conventions as dramatically as she had. "We want to propose something that's never been tried before in this territory," Thomas continued. "A formal agreement between the white settlements and the Navajo bands, not imposed by government officials or army officers who don't understand the country, but negotiated by people who have to live with the consequences. Trade agreements, grazing rights, water access, protection for travelers from both sides, a real peace based on mutual benefit rather than mutual fear. The scope of what he was suggesting took Isabella's breath away. Such an agreement would require both sides to abandon generations of mistrust and hostility, to risk everything on the possibility that cooperation might succeed where conflict had only brought suffering to everyone involved. It was the kind of visionary thinking that she had dreamed about during her long conversations with Joseph, but had never dared believe could become reality. Joseph was staring at Thomas with an expression of amazement that matched Isabella's own. "You would risk your standing in the white community to propose such a thing?" he asked. "Your people would call you a traitor, an Indian lover, maybe worse." "My people already call me the man who tried to murder his own daughter for the crime of falling in love," Thomas replied. "My reputation cannot sink much lower than it already has. But more than that, I've had 3 days to think about what kind of world I want to leave behind when I die. Do I want to be remembered as the man who perpetuated hatred and violence, or as someone who helped build something better?" The elderly Navajo woman who had questioned Thomas's motives earlier now studied him with calculating eyes, weighing his words against decades of experience with white promises that had been broken as easily as they were made. "Such agreements have been tried before," she said carefully. "They last only until one side decides the other has something they want more than peace. Then we'll build this one differently," Isabella said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Not as a treaty imposed from above, but as a living agreement between families and communities who choose to trust each other day by day. Not perfect, not guaranteed to last forever, but real enough to give our children a chance to grow up in a world where love doesn't have to be hidden or punished." She looked around the circle of faces surrounding the fire, seeing hope and skepticism warring in equal measure. These were practical people who understood that words were easy, but change was hard, that good intentions could be destroyed by a single act of violence or betrayal. But she also saw something else, a willingness to try, to risk disappointment and heartbreak for the chance that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. "I'll need Joseph beside me," she said, addressing her father directly. "Not hidden away or forced to deny who he is, but recognized as my husband in the eyes of both our peoples. Can you accept that? Can your friends accept it?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face working through emotions that had been building for days. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. "I've already lost one daughter to my pride and prejudice," he said. "I won't lose another to the same poison. If Joseph Crowfeather is the man you've chosen to love, then he'll be welcomed as my son-in-law and treated with the respect that choice deserves." The words seemed to break some kind of spell that had held the entire camp in suspended animation. Conversations began to bloom around the various fires as people processed what they had just witnessed, the implications spreading outward in ripples that would eventually reach every corner of both communities. Joseph took Isabella's hand in his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of two people who belonged together, despite every obstacle the world had thrown in their path. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "This won't be easy. There will be people on both sides who never accept what we're trying to build, who will see our love as weakness to be exploited or betrayal to be punished." Isabella squeezed his hand and smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she had worn since this ordeal began. "I'm certain," she said, "not because it will be easy, but because it's right, because love should make the world bigger, not smaller, because our children deserve better than the hatred that nearly destroyed us." As the sun finally disappeared, Below the western horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the deepening sky, Isabella Carson and Joseph Crowfeather stood hand in hand beside a desert fire, surrounded by two peoples who had chosen hope over hatred, love over fear, the difficult work of building bridges over the familiar comfort of maintaining walls. The future they were choosing would be full of challenges and setbacks, moments when the old hatred would resurface and threaten to destroy everything they were trying to create. But it would also be full of possibilities that had never existed before. Children who carried the blood of both peoples, friendships that crossed cultural lines, communities that thrived on cooperation rather than conflict. Most importantly, it would be a future where love like theirs could exist openly, celebrated rather than punished, seen as a source of strength rather than shame. 6 months later, Isabella and Joseph were married in a ceremony that blended traditions from both cultures, held at the rocking Sea Ranch before an audience that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. The Navajo Anglo Cooperation Accord they helped negotiate became a model for similar agreements throughout the Southwest, proving that peace was possible when people chose understanding over fear. The story of the woman who was chained in Coyote, hollow for loving across racial lines, and of the warrior who proved that rescue sometimes means choosing mercy over vengeance, became a legend passed down through generations of both peoples. Not as a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but as a reminder that love, real love, has the power to transform hatred into hope if we have the courage to let it. 5 years after Isabella Carson first felt the bite of iron shackles against her wrists in Coyote Hollow, she stood on the front porch of the sprawling adobe house that had grown from the original Rocking Sea Ranch buildings, watching her 2-year-old son take his first tentative steps while his Navajo grandfather offered encouraging words in a mixture of English and Diné that had become the natural language of their blended household. The morning sun painted the Verde Valley in shades of gold and amber, illuminating a landscape that bore witness to transformations as profound as any the desert had ever seen. The woman who gazed across this thriving community bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had once been chained to stone and left to die for the crime of loving across racial boundaries. Isabella's face, now touched with the confident glow of someone who had found her true purpose in life, reflected the deep satisfaction that came from building something beautiful out of the ashes of hatred and prejudice. Her hands, once soft, from the sheltered life of a rancher's daughter, now bore the calluses and small scars that came from years of real work, negotiating treaties, managing complex business partnerships, and raising a child who would never know the artificial boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable. Joseph emerged from the ranch house carrying a leather portfolio filled with the latest correspondence from territorial officials who had come to view the Carson-Crow-Feather Cooperation Accord as a model worth replicating throughout the Southwest. His silver jewelry business had expanded beyond anything he had imagined possible during his days as a wandering trader, with orders coming from as far away as San Francisco and Denver. But it was his role as chief negotiator for the intertribal trading agreements that had truly transformed him from a skilled artisan into a respected leader whose opinions carried weight in territorial councils and whose advice was sought by government officials struggling to maintain peace in a rapidly changing land. "The delegation from Santa Fe arrives this afternoon," he said, settling beside Isabella on the wooden bench they had built together during their first winter. As husband and wife, when the future had seemed uncertain and their love had required constant defense against those who viewed it as unnatural or dangerous. "They want to discuss extending our water-sharing agreements to include the Rio Grande settlements. It seems our little experiment in cooperation has attracted attention from some very powerful people who are beginning to understand that peace might be more profitable than constant warfare. Isabella smiled as she watched their son, Thomas. Joseph, named for both his grandfathers in a gesture of reconciliation that had once seemed impossible. The child bore the distinctive features of both his parents' peoples, his mother's green eyes and copper hair combined with his father's bronze skin and strong bone structure, creating a face that seemed to bridge worlds with unconscious ease. He toddled between the encouraging arms of Tahoma Silversmith, who had evolved from Joseph's cousin and rescuer into Isabella's closest advisor in navigating the complex political landscape of territorial business and intercultural diplomacy. The ranch itself had become something unprecedented in the American Southwest, a working demonstration that cooperation between different peoples could produce prosperity for everyone involved. Mexican vaqueros worked alongside Navajo horsemen and white ranch hands, their different techniques and traditions blending into methods more effective than any single approach could have achieved. The cattle that grazed the expanded pastures were healthier and more productive than any Thomas Carson had managed to raise, using traditional methods, and the horses bred using combined knowledge from 3 different cultures were becoming legendary throughout the territory for their intelligence, endurance, and temperament. Do you think he'll grow up taking all this for granted? Isabella asked, gesturing toward the remarkable scene unfolding in the ranch yard below them. A group of children played together in the dust, their games conducted in a fluid mixture of English, Spanish, and Navajo that flowed as naturally as the stream that watered their gardens. Among them were white children, whose parents had once sworn they would never allow their offspring to associate with savages. Navajo children, whose grandparents remembered when all contact with white men meant death or displacement, and Mexican children whose families had been caught between conflicting claims of sovereignty for generations. Will he ever understand how impossible this all seemed just a few years ago? Isabella continued, her voice carrying both hope and concern for the future they were creating. Sometimes I worry that if our children never experience the hatred and fear that brought us together, they won't understand how precious this peace really is, how much it cost to build, and how easily it could be destroyed. Joseph followed her gaze to where their son was now being lifted high into the air by his grandfather, Thomas Carson, whose weathered face had regained much of its former strength and purpose through his dedicated work on behalf of the Cooperation Accord. The transformation of the proud, prejudiced rancher into one of the territory's most effective advocates for intercultural understanding had been as dramatic as any aspect of their unlikely success story. Thomas had thrown himself into the project of building bridges between communities with the same fierce determination that had once made him successful at accumulating land and cattle. And the results had surprised everyone, including himself. I hope he takes it for granted, Joseph replied thoughtfully, his hand finding Isabella's and intertwining their fingers with the easy intimacy of a couple whose love had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than before. I hope he grows up in a world where love between different peoples is so normal that he cannot imagine it any other way. That would mean we succeeded in what we set out to build, a place where our children can love freely without fear of chains or violence or rejection from their own families. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road that wound down from the main territorial highway, where a small group of riders was kicking up dust in their haste to reach the ranch. Isabella recognized the lead rider as Samuel Morrison, the territorial clerk who had helped draft the original property transfer documents that had given her the legal power to protect Joseph and his people from retaliation. Morrison's usual nervous demeanor had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like excitement, and the official documents case bouncing against his saddle suggested news of considerable importance. Mr. and Mrs. Crow Feather, Morrison called out as he dismounted near the front porch, using the legal name that Isabella had adopted after their marriage. Despite the raised eyebrows it continued to generate in some territorial circles. His formal greeting carried none of the uncertain deference that had marked his earlier interactions with their unconventional household. "I bring extraordinary news from the territorial capital. The governor himself wishes to visit your ranch next month to discuss implementing your cooperation model throughout Arizona territory." The implications of such official recognition sent a thrill of pride and terror through Isabella in equal measure. Success on such a scale would mean that their personal love story had transcended its individual circumstances to become something larger. A proof of concept that might influence policy decisions affecting thousands of people across the Southwest. But it would also mean increased scrutiny from those who still viewed their marriage and their business partnerships as dangerous precedents that threatened the established order of racial hierarchy and cultural separation. Morrison continued, reading from his official documents, his voice gaining strength as he realized the magnitude of what he was announcing. "The governor has been following reports of your success here for over 2 years, and he believes your methods could be the key to ending the cycle of raids and retaliation that has cost the territory so much in lives and resources. He wants to establish a formal commission with federal backing to study your agreements and develop policies that could be implemented throughout the Southwest." Isabella felt Joseph's grip on her hand tighten as they both began to understand what was being offered and what it would cost them to accept such responsibility. The quiet life they had built, the careful balance they had maintained between their different communities, the personal relationships that had made their success possible. All of it would change if they became public figures responsible for territorial policy rather than private individuals managing their own affairs. "What does the governor want specifically?" Joseph asked, his tone carefully neutral as he evaluated the political implications of such high-level attention. His years as an army scout had taught him to be suspicious of government officials bearing gifts, especially when those gifts came with strings attached that might not be immediately visible. The federal government's track record with native peoples was not encouraging, regardless of current good intentions. Morrison consulted another document from his saddlebags, his excitement causing him to speak more rapidly than usual. He wants to establish a territorial commission on intercultural relations, with you and Mrs. Crowfeather as co-chairmen. The commission would have authority to negotiate formal treaties between white settlements and native communities, with federal backing and military enforcement of the agreements. You would essentially become the primary architects of Indian policy for the entire Southwest. Isabella felt the weight of such responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. They had succeeded on a small scale by keeping their agreements personal and flexible, by dealing with people they knew and trusted, rather than distant bureaucrats who saw communities as statistics rather than families. Scaling up to territorial level would inevitably mean compromising some of that personal touch in favor of policies that could be applied uniformly across diverse situations and conflicting interests. But it would also mean the opportunity to prevent other young women from being chained in desert canyons for the crime of loving the wrong person, to ensure that other families didn't have to choose between their children and their prejudices, to create a framework for cooperation that might last long enough for future generations to build upon and improve. After Morrison and his companions departed with promises to return the following week for a formal answer, Isabella and Joseph spent the remainder of the afternoon walking the boundaries of their expanded property, discussing the offer and its implications while their son napped safely in his grandfather Thomas's arms. The ranch had grown from its original 2,000 acres to encompass nearly 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, much of it leased from Navajo tribal authorities under the innovative agreements they had negotiated. The land supported Not just cattle and horses, but an entire community of people who had chosen cooperation over conflict. Anglo ranchers worked alongside Navajo herders, sharing techniques and resources that benefited everyone involved. Mexican vaqueros taught rope work to Apache scouts, who in turn shared tracking skills that had been refined over generations of desert survival. Their children played together in the dirt without any awareness that such friendships had once been considered impossible, and their marriages were beginning to create a new generation that would grow up truly bicultural. More importantly, the economic success of their cooperative ventures had begun to attract attention from business interests throughout the territory. Merchants who had once refused to deal with native peoples now competed for contracts to supply the Carson Crow feather operations, and the profits generated by their partnerships had provided resources for schools, medical care, and infrastructure. Improvements that benefited entire communities, regardless of racial or cultural background. "Are you afraid?" Isabella asked as they paused beside the stream where she and Joseph had shared their first kiss all those years ago. The water ran clear and cold from mountain springs, unmarked by the blood that might have stained it if their story had ended differently. Nurturing cottonwood groves where their children now played and learned and grew into something their grandparents could never have imagined. "Terrified," Joseph admitted, pulling her close against his side as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. Not of the work itself, but of what failure would mean. If we accept this responsibility and cannot live up to it, if the commission becomes just another way for government officials to control native peoples while pretending to respect their rights, then we will have betrayed everything we've worked to build here. Isabella nodded, understanding his concerns because she shared them completely. They had succeeded by maintaining the human scale of their relationships, by treating each negotiation as a conversation between neighbors rather than a contest between enemies, by building trust slowly and carefully over time rather than imposing solutions from above. Government commissions, no matter how well-intentioned, had a tendency to become bureaucratic machines that served their own perpetuation rather than the people they were supposed to help. "But if we don't accept," she said quietly, "then someone else will. Someone who might not understand what we've learned about building trust between peoples who have every reason to hate each other. Someone who might turn the commission into just another tool for maintaining the status quo while pretending to create change." They stood in comfortable silence as darkness gathered around them, each lost in thoughts about roads taken and not taken, about the young people they had been when love first brought them together, about the responsibilities that came with proving that cooperation was possible between communities that had been taught to see each other as enemies. The weight of their decision seemed to press down on them like the vast desert sky, full of possibilities and dangers in equal measure. When they finally returned to the house, they found their extended family gathered around the kitchen table for the evening meal that had become a cherished ritual. Thomas Carson sat beside his Navajo counterpart, an elderly man named Henry B. Gay, who had become one of Joseph's most trusted advisors, the two grandfathers competing good-naturedly to see who could make young Thomas Joseph laugh most enthusiastically. While they shared stories from their respective cultures, Tahoma Silversmith occupied his usual place at Isabella's right hand, his role as chief negotiator for the cooperation agreements having evolved into something resembling that of a territorial diplomat. His wife, a spirited Mexican woman named Carmen, whom he had married 2 years earlier in a ceremony that had drawn guests from 6 different communities, managed the household accounts with the same precision she had once applied to running her family's trading post in Tucson. Around the table sat ranch hands and business partners, tribal elders and territorial officials, children who spoke 3 languages fluently, and adults who had learned to see past the color of skin to the character of hearts. It was, Isabella realized, exactly the kind of family she had dreamed of creating during those dark hours chained in Coyote Hollow. Not perfect, not without occasional disagreements and conflicts, but real and loving and committed to building something better than what they had inherited. "We've decided to accept the governor's offer," Joseph announced, after everyone had filled their plates with Carmen's famous green chili stew, a recipe that had become legendary throughout the territory, and now served as the unofficial centerpiece of every important gathering. "But with conditions that will ensure the commission serves the people it's meant to help, rather than the politicians who created it." The announcement sparked immediate discussion around the table as everyone began to understand the implications for their own lives and communities. Taking on such responsibility would mean changes for all of them. New challenges and opportunities, risks that could either elevate their cooperative model to influence territorial policy or destroy it through the corruption that seemed to contaminate most government endeavors. But as Isabella listened to the animated conversations swirling around the table, she felt a deep sense of confidence in the decision they had made. These people, her chosen family, bound together not by blood, but by shared commitment to building bridges rather than walls, had already proven that cooperation was possible. They had created something beautiful and functional out of circumstances that should have produced only hatred and violence. 3 months later, the Arizona Territorial Commission on Intercultural Relations held its first official meeting in a specially constructed building on the Carson Crow Feather Ranch, with representatives from 23 different communities attending sessions conducted in 5 languages. The agreements reached during that first gathering established principles of mutual respect, resource sharing, and conflict resolution that would eventually be adopted throughout the American Southwest and become models for similar efforts in other territories. The Commission's work was not without setbacks and challenges. There were communities on both sides of the cultural divide that refused to participate. Political opponents who worked to undermine their efforts through legislative maneuvering and media campaigns, and violent incidents that threatened to destroy. Years of patient bridge building in a single afternoon of bloodshed. But the foundation they had built proved stronger than the forces arrayed against it, and each crisis overcome only reinforced the value of the cooperative approach they championed. But the real measure of their success was not found in official documents or government proclamations. It was visible in the children who played together without awareness of racial boundaries, in the marriages that crossed cultural lines without causing family ruptures, in the communities that thrived on diversity rather than suffering from division, in the schools where children learned the history and traditions of all the peoples who had shaped the Southwest, rather than just the version preferred by the politically dominant group. 7 years after the first commission meeting, when young Thomas Joseph Carson Crow Feather celebrated his 9th birthday with a party that included friends from 6 different cultural backgrounds, he could hardly imagine a world where his parents' love would have been considered shameful or dangerous. The peace they had built was not perfect. There were still incidents, still people who preferred old hatreds to new hopes, still politicians who found it profitable to exploit fear and resentment for electoral gain. But it was real and growing stronger with each generation. Isabella often returned to Coyote Hollow during the anniversary of her ordeal. Not to relive the trauma, but to remember how much was possible when people chose love over fear, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair. The narrow canyon remained, unchanged by the years, its red stone walls still bearing the ancient petroglyphs that had witnessed her rescue and transformation. The iron shackles still lay where Tahoma had left them, slowly rusting away in the desert weather, becoming one with the stone that had once held them. Standing in that sacred place where she had once faced death for the crime of loving freely, Isabella would offer a prayer of gratitude for the chain of choices and chances that had brought her to a life beyond anything she could have imagined possible during those dark hours when survival itself seemed unlikely. She would think about the woman she had been, frightened, abandoned, condemned by her own people, and marvel at the distance she had traveled not just geographically but spiritually and emotionally. Sometimes Joseph would join her on these pilgrimages, and they would sit together in the shade of the overhanging rock where she had once been chained, sharing memories and dreams, planning for the future and reflecting on the past. They would speak of their son and the world he was inheriting, of the Commission's work and its impact on communities throughout the Southwest, of their hopes that the peace they had helped build would prove durable enough to survive whatever challenges the future might bring. The legacy of the woman who was shackled in Coyote Hollow for loving an Indian, and of the Navajo warrior who proved that true strength sometimes meant choosing mercy over vengeance, lived on in every child who grew up believing that love was stronger than hatred, in every community that chose cooperation over conflict, in every person who dared to build bridges across the artificial divisions that fear and ignorance had constructed between human hearts. Their story became a testament to the transformative power of love that refuses to be contained by the narrow boundaries others try to impose, proving that sometimes the most radical act of courage is simply choosing to love openly and without apology, no matter what the world might say about such dangerous devotion. In a land that had known too much violence and too little hope, they had created something precious and enduring, a demonstration that peace was possible, that love could triumph over hatred, and that the future could be better than the past if people had the courage to choose hope over fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.